All right, so the thing we're starting with is the Republic, Book One. And I want to say a little bit in this first lecture about, why we're even reading this, what's going on here. And so the first thing you might notice is that this is written in the form of a dialogue. You have these characters, they present different theories of justice, or rather, Thrasymachus and Polemarchus do. Socrates kind of shoots them down or gives them a hard time. You know, One question you might be asking is, well, are these real people? Did these conversations happen? And the answer is it's complicated. Socrates was a real person. Um, he did, in fact, go into public spaces and have these debates with people where he questioned them about, concepts like justice or beauty or things like that. But we don't think, in fact, we're pretty sure that he never had conversations specifically like the ones you see in the Republic. Plato was a student of Socrates, and Plato thought that he was developing Socrates' thoughts further, and he kind of uses Socrates as a character in these dialogues that present his own theories. There are some other dialogues where we think Plato might have been more accurately representing debates Socrates actually had. This is not really one of them. He uses Socrates more as a character to present his own views. But Socrates really did do this kind of thing. This was the way he went about, you know, his own pursuit of philosophy, which was to ask people questions, ask them for definitions of these important terms. Okay, so why read this? Well, even though this is very, very old, I mean, this comes from over 2,000 years ago, it's a pretty good model of what philosophy is and how it's done. You know, when you get right down to it, I think that philosophy is nothing more than a conversation and a debate. So, what you see Socrates doing here with Thrasymachus, with Polemarchus, more with Thrasymachus, well, to be blunt about it, he's smarter than Polemarchus. Polemarchus is not, well, I'll give it a nice way to say it, but there aren't any. Thrasymachus is a lot sharper than he is. But what you see in these debates is really, I think, just what philosophy is and how it's done. I'll talk more about that in a second, and we'll see more details as we go through the dialogue, as we go through the debates, conversations Socrates has with these two guys. And I think, one of the really interesting things here is Thrasymachus's challenge to justice. Thrasymachus challenges the idea that justice is a good or important thing. Now, for reasons I'll talk about, this is really radical. For Greeks of Socrates and Thrasymachus' day, Plato's day, justice was kind of the central moral concept. So when you hear Thrasymachus challenging justice, it really is almost a challenge to just morality generally. And in fact, if you just replaced or added morality when Thrasymachus says justice, I don't think you'd really be changing his meaning a whole lot. All right. So back to what I was saying about method. You often hear Socrates and Plato's method called dialectic, and that's just a fancy way of talking about a certain kind of dialogue or discussion with another person. What you'll see Socrates doing, he will ask the person he's talking with for a definition and account of some really important concept. Here it's justice. When we read the Euthyphro in a few weeks, it'll be piety. Other ones, it's beauty, virtue, so on and so forth. The person will then give him a definition of this term, and Socrates will see if the definition fits with our ordinary thoughts about the concept. He'll ask him for an account, then he'll put some pressure on the account. And we'll see what this looks like. I don't think Polemarchus is really a great thinker, mean, I think he's supposed to be basically just a snotty kid, a teenager, right? Giving the old folks a hard time. You know, the snotty 14 or 15-year-old in the back of the room. Maybe we shouldn't give him too hard a time because we might have been that kid. And if we were, well, probably weren't always, at the top of our game either, right? Looking back. Anyway, I do think it's worth going through what Socrates does with Polemarchus before we get into Thrasymachus, because we can kind of see what this practice of dialectic, what this practice of philosophy looks like. So, Polemarchus, Socrates says, well, give me your definition of justice. And Polemarchus isn't incredibly radical, right? He's trying to show that the old folks are wrong. He says, well, justice isn't what you guys think it is, but justice is still important. It's just you old guys, you're wrong about what justice really is. I know what justice really is. Polemarchus says, well, look, justice is giving each person what he is owed. That's my thumbnail, short definition, Socrates. That's what justice is. You think about it. You owe friends good things, you owe enemies bad things. In Polemarchus' account, justice isn't being nice to everyone, it's not treating everyone well, it's giving people what they're owed, right? Which in the case of friends is good things, in the case of enemies, bad things. Bit of a challenge to Socrates. He wouldn't back up this with like help your friends hurt your enemies account of justice, but it still thinks justice is important if you're Polemarchus. Well, so Socrates pushes back and he says, well, look, what about the case where a friend of yours lent you a weapon? I think it's a sword in his case. We can think of a gun or something else. They lend you a weapon and, obviously you owe it back to them. If you borrow something from somebody, you owe it back. You should give it back. But when it comes time to give it back, or when they ask for it back, they're mentally disturbed in some way. Maybe they're drunk. Maybe they're just upset. We can imagine they're having some kind of temporary mental break. Well, what would you, Polemarchus, say? Should we give them the weapon back? Well, obviously not, right? You don't give your friend back a weapon if he's just going to hurt himself or get himself into trouble with it. That would not be just. It would not be good for your friend. It wouldn't be just more generally, right? Because if you know your friend is going to go out and commit a crime with this weapon, how could it be just to give it back to them? Well, why does this create a problem for Polemarchus? Well, it seems that his theory says you should give the weapon back, right? You owe them the weapon. Justice is giving each person what he is owed. Not only does justice say you should give it back, it would be unjust not to, right? That's a huge problem because that is a crazy claim. That is just silly. And this is what we see Socrates doing. He is offering what philosophers call a counterexample. And he does this a lot. This is part of his general way of doing things, and this is part of the general way of doing things of philosophers generally. It's one of those things that makes us kind of annoying sometimes. But only sometimes. Most of the time everybody loves us and we're not at all annoying. That's a joke. But it's one of the things that makes us especially annoying, right? And what a counterexample is you try to show that a theory or account gives an obviously wrong, flat out crazy, or just silly answer. If your theory of justice says we have to give back a weapon to a mentally disturbed person who is going to harm himself and others with it, well, then that's a problem for your theory of justice. So Socrates will do this a lot. He'll try to show, well, look, your account is going to land us with an obviously wrong or silly answer. He'll do this with Thrasymachus, although Thrasymachus is a little harder to pin down, a little harder to catch, because he is a lot smarter than Polemarchus. Now, we will see this a lot in philosophy, this idea of counterexamples, and there's 4 possible responses. One is to just show that the person who's throwing out a counterexample has misunderstood you, that your theory doesn't really give this crazy result. When we get to Nozick in a few weeks, I'm going to argue that I think this sort of counterexample Nozick tries to give against Rawls, this guy he's arguing with, is actually a case where he's just being unfair. The theory doesn't give that crazy answer. If Rawls were to respond to Nozick, I think he'd just say, look, you're just wrong. You don't understand my theory. It actually doesn't give the crazy answer you think it does. Now, that's uncommon, and we should try to understand the people we are arguing with so we don't do that. In the case where the counterexample is a real problem, then the person arguing has three other responses. One is to just modify or work out their theory to avoid the counterexample. That is the most common, and it's what we see Polemarchus doing at first. Or you can just discard your theory. You can say, okay, well, all right, Socrates, you win, or all right, whoever else, yeah, my theory gives these crazy results. My theory's wrong then. We'll have to come up with another theory entirely. The fourth response is to accept the seemingly crazy result of your theory. Yes, my account of justice, if Polemarchus did this, he'd say, well, look, yeah, my account of justice, yeah, it says you should do this, but you know what? Actually, I think that's right. Now, Polemarchus is not going to do this. Polemarchus is going to take option 2 here. He's going to try to work out his theory to avoid the counterexample, but sometimes people will take option 4. Call it bite the bullet, after those old westerns where somebody has to get a bullet picked out or a leg sawed off without any sort of numbing beyond like whiskey, right? Give him a bullet to bite because it hurts like crazy. The idea is biting the bullet is unpleasant. You want to avoid it if you can. We will see that when we get to utilitarianism, some examples of philosophers biting the bullet and accepting what seem to be crazy results. We'll talk about why you might do that, why it might not be the worst thing in the world later on. Generally, you want to avoid it. All right. Back to Polemarchus. Polemarchus then gives, after Socrates gives him a hard time, gives him a push, he gives a second definition of justice. He says, well, justice is benefiting your friends and harming your enemies. He just makes explicit what was already at work there. He's like, well, justice is benefiting your friends, harming your enemies. Now notice, he's not discarding, he's not throwing away his first account of justice. He's just saying, well, this is really what it's getting at. Giving each what he's owed. Well, you owe your enemies harm. You owe your friends benefits. Not discarding my first account, just giving a better take on it, working it out to avoid Socrates' problem. And, they don't really talk about this, but this would avoid the counterexample Socrates throws out to start with, right? If you give your friend a weapon when he is mentally disturbed, you are not benefiting your friend, right? Because he's going to harm himself and maybe harm others. Given the nature of like social relationships, circles of friends, decent chance that the people he's going to hurt are also friends of yours, right? So wouldn't give this crazy answer because this is a case where you are actually harming your friends, right? Well, Socrates makes another move. And he says, well, look, what if your friends are bad people? What if your enemies are good people, right? No, you might harm a good person who doesn't deserve harm, and benefit bad ones. More fundamentally, what if you're wrong about who your friends are, what your friends are like, and who your enemies are, and what your enemies are like, right? You might not only harm someone who's a good person, you might harm someone who actually doesn't intend you ill. You only think they do, right? You might not only benefit somebody who's a terrible person, you might benefit somebody who actually wants to hurt you. That doesn't look like justice, right? To benefit bad people or hurt good people, that's just a crazy account of justice Socrates thinks. Polemarchus kind of, you know, he takes option 3 at this point. He's like, okay, Socrates, you win, right? I guess my account of justice just doesn't work. More or less, he never really says, throws his hands up, cries uncle, and all that. That's more or less where we end up. Now, this is where the interesting stuff starts because Thrasymachus gets really annoyed, to put it politely, right? And Thrasymachus just says, no, 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 Polemarchus, you're letting this guy get one over on you. You're not going far enough. In a sense, Polemarchus does want to bite the bullet here. In fact, but he doesn't just want to say, yeah, yeah, it's like that. He wants to go further. He says, well, look, your mistake is thinking that justice is a good thing at all. Justice, what you, Polemarchus, should do is just reject this idea that justice is important at all. You don't go far enough. When you actually go far enough, you will see that justice is not important. In fact, it's bad, and we should not want to be just. Your mistake, Polemarchus, is not wanting to give the old people a hard time about being wrong about what justice is. Your mistake is wanting to get a better account of what justice is when you should go further and just say, well, the old people are wrong in thinking that justice is a good thing or important thing. Now, what Thrasymachus' radical challenge looks like, we'll talk about in the next few lectures.